Hello, and thank you for tuning in for another episode of the Parenting Pickup. I'm Kara Johnson Bader, your host, and this month we're extremely lucky to have Amanda Woodward. Amanda is an assistant teaching professor at the University of Minnesota. She received her PhD in cognitive psychology from the University of Maryland and currently studies how children think about relationships and how it relates to people's behavior. She also studies exclusion, or how children respond to being left out. She is with us in the studio today to help us better understand some of the social habits and needs of our children. Welcome, Amanda.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm so glad you're here because there's so much to talk about when it comes to what children are absorbing and relating to in these areas in early childhood. So let's jump right in. Amanda, how would you describe your journey in researching early childhood social behavior?
Yeah, so I grew up with a pretty large extended family, and my first niece was born while I was in college and starting to learn all about psychology. So it was really cool to see her start to learn about the world around her as I was learning all the different words to describe it. And I really enjoyed seeing her interact with her other cousins. Some were older, some were younger. And really, as she was getting older, kind of hearing how she would talk about these experiences. And it started going from, I like this, or I like that, to who she was friends with, who she wanted to play with, maybe who she didn't. And it was really cool to start to think about relationships through her eyes and sort of what counted as a relationship. And I was sort of comparing what she was seeing to what I was experiencing as an adult, and my relationships were very different from what she was describing. So when I was thinking about graduate school and learning more about psychology, I had this in mind sort of, well, how is Callie thinking about these things? And what did that mean in terms of what other children were thinking? And that's led me into the research that I'm still doing now and thinking about how kids think about friendship and also what they think about times where people get left out.
That's really fascinating. It's really fun to think about your journey and learning about friendships and children and how they feel about that, and then also how they feel when they're excluded. How would you differentiate social behavior between different age groups? And I'm really speaking about toddlers, kind of preschoolers, and school agers.
Yeah, so I think in thinking about the way social behavior develops, one of the things that I wasn't expecting was that it starts really early. So even within infancy, we're seeing babies who are trying to explore the social world around them. They're really interested in faces, they're making eye contact with people, they're starting to recognize their caregivers and people who are around all of the time. As they get older, we start to see this social aspect from what we think of as adults, where they're kind of going back and forth. So they do these things called proto-conversations where they take turns making noises and waiting for their caregiver to make a noise back. When they're getting older, we're starting to see more advanced behaviors that we might notice more as adults. So there's this idea of joint attention where they'll look where someone else is looking because they realize we're not just looking at things, but we're really using that as a way to communicate. Once they become toddlers, we're seeing them sort of be able to walk and talk and communicate with those around them. And we're seeing that their social behaviors are changing. So around 2, they're engaging in something called parallel play, where they'll be playing next to someone, not necessarily together. The play is still very independent, but that act of being close to someone is counting as play. And then they also do this thing where they'll watch other people play, and that counts as playing to them. So they can see older kids or other kids engaging in a game, and just watching them is a form of play. Once they get into preschool, we're seeing a little bit of a shift. So it's still pretty independent, but they're starting to engage in similar activities with a group. So I like to think about this: if you see kids on a playground, they don't just sort of all do totally different things and ignore each other, but they'll all be on the same piece of equipment, but some might be swinging, some might be climbing. They're all kind of engaged in relatively similar types of play. And then toward the end of preschool, we see them start to engage in what I think of when I think of play, which is that cooperative piece where they're actually working with people to do the same thing, whether that's play a board game, accomplish some kind of task in the play, but they're really working together and acknowledging the other person. And one of the things that I think that's really cool about that is that's also when we're starting to see them do more pretend play together, where they're making up scenarios, they're engaging in things like fantasy play, And we can also see that kind of involve imaginary friends as they start to get into that kindergarten age.
That's so fascinating to think about that entire journey of how play evolves over time. And you're right, it's really fun to watch at each stage and then see that kind of imaginary play where they'll pretend like, I'll be the mom and you be the baby. With all that, can you share some key findings from your research on how social behaviors develop in early childhood and what are some of the most influential factors during this stage?
So some of the research that I'm doing now is looking at how kids think about people who play with others and who leave others out. And what we're seeing is there seems to be a difference in the ways that children are thinking about these people. So I call them excluders and includers, but whichever way you want to think about it. And what we're seeing is across the board that kids tend to think of people who leave others out or these excluders in negative ways. So they'll say things like, these people are mean. They also tend to think of people who play with others or let others play with them in a positive way. So they're thinking these people are nice, they're better sharers. And if you bring new people into the fold and say, well, which of these groups should they play with? Kids are identifying that they should play with the inclusive folks more. What I think is really interesting is there also seems to be some differences in the way that kids are seeing scenarios when they are the one involved versus if they're watching it happen with someone else. So when kids are being excluded, we're seeing a slightly different pattern in the sense that the things that I've just mentioned, the viewing excluders negatively and includers positively, is happening a little bit later. When they're watching it, they seem to not have much of an issue identifying these patterns at 3. So some of what I'm interested in now is kind of figuring out why these things might be different. One thing could be that the method we use is a little bit different between those two studies, and the one requires a little more memory from kids. So the ways that they're thinking about situations, what they're remembering, it just takes a little more time for those to come online. But we're doing another study now to try to see if any of that method plays a role. The other thing that could be happening, and what I think would be more important for social behavior development, is that kids just might be responding in different ways because that's how they think through different social patterns. So in one case, they might be having more of an emotional reaction. If they're the ones being left out, that's something that they have to cope with. It could also be that they're employing some kind of strategy. So if they're being left out, they might change their answers to try to be like, oh no, I'm nice, you should include me next time.
Wow, that is just really interesting. With that, are there specific environments or activities that seem to foster stronger social development?
Yeah, so I think one of the most important things for fostering social development and emotional development is play. Anytime we engage in play, kids are able to kind of open up a different side. They're learning a whole lot, and it can help them both come up with social skills that they'll need later in life, as well as develop some emotional pieces that they need. So for instance, in thinking about things that can be helpful, acting things out with puppets, asking kids to think about what emotions characters might be feeling in stories, all of those are going to be really helpful in their sort of real-world social interactions. And then another piece that comes up that's really important for kids' social development is their development of friendship, which I don't think is a surprise to anyone. But getting that chance to take turns to understand that people have different perspectives, different preferences, and might be approaching things from different angles can be very helpful.
It really sounds like play is just critical to development overall.
Absolutely.
What would you say are some common social behavior challenges young children face, and how can parents and educators support children in overcoming these challenges to promote kind of healthy social growth?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question when we think about young kids because there's so much going on in their lives. Things are changing when they're going to school, but also things like impulse control are changing, so whether they're able to sort of inhibit that initial reaction to something. And they're also learning how to sort of self-regulate and sort of how they're supposed to act when they're around other people. So I think there's going to be lots of challenges with that because all of those things are going to change and develop and come online for different kids at different ages. And I think one thing that can happen is that kids can experience conflict when, they don't want to take turns or they have a favorite toy that they don't want to share. Or someone else has the new shiny thing that they really want. And I think it can be a lot to sort of ask them to come up with a way to deal with that on their own. And I think that's where parents and educators can really play a role. So some things that we can do are things like making sure that when we're talking about something that's happening, we're explaining what happened and not assuming that kids know exactly what just happened or why we're upset or why they're upset. And using words that they can understand. So making sure it's simple enough for them, but it's clearly talking about what has happened. Beyond what's happening, making sure they know the consequences of that. So you rip the toy out of Johnny's hand, Johnny's upset, maybe that toy has become broken. They may not be picking up on that because they might just be in their own world of, I wanted this and now I have it, or I don't. And then another piece would be just making sure to talk about what could be done differently, because they don't always know if they're reacting immediately. And I think it can be hard to do this sometimes, but making sure that this is done in a calm way versus yelling. And when emotions are high, obviously that can be a little bit harder. Another thing to keep in mind is that kids may not be able to identify how they're feeling. They just might be experiencing that emotion physically. And being able to help them sort of identify what they're feeling, where that's coming from, can be really helpful. And I think there's lots of books and movies, like Inside Out's a great one for helping sort of identify what those pieces are. And then because behavior regulation can be quite difficult, sometimes part of what's going on there is kids don't recognize why we have rules for them. So it can be really helpful to just sort of walk through, why do I want this to be done a certain way, or why is this the rule that we have in our house, to make sure that they understand sort of what's going on and why it's important and that it's not just arbitrary.
So tell me, what impact can it have on young children if they're, consistently excluded from play? And how can we help them cope with that experience?
Yeah, so I think one thing with social exclusion that is both fascinating and also a problem is that it can have different effects across the lifespan. We know with adults and adolescents, when they're excluded, that we can see negative effects both in terms of the way they think about the world around them, but also sort of their social behavior. So when they're excluded, it's affecting what they're thinking, what they're remembering from different situations, and then whether or not they're choosing to approach other people. So for instance, sometimes what we see as excluded teenagers or adults will take one of two approaches. One is they'll sort of withdraw from others when they're being excluded and say, this isn't for me, which is unfortunate because we know that when you're included and you have those social connections, that it can really make a difference in a lot of areas of well-being. The other thing they can do is that they can sort of succumb to peer pressure and just sort of do whatever they think the in-crowd is doing. And that's also not great if they're into some problematic behaviors. And what we see with these groups is sort of as exclusion happens, as these different responses and consequences happen, they can get worse over time. So the more you experience exclusion, the worse all of this can get, which is really not a place that we want to be. When we think about young kids, we do see some of these effects. So young children who are excluded, it does change what they remember from different situations. It can affect sort of how they're thinking about the social world around them and who they want to play with. What we don't see as much in really young kids is this emotional response. Or at least in the US, we don't see much of an emotional response to some of these exclusion type events. And part of the reason that might be happening is, again, if we're thinking about young kids who are between 2 and 4, some of them are still engaging in this more independent or parallel play. So I think one of the big takeaways is that, what we think of as exclusion as adults may not actually be what kids are experiencing in that moment. I think the biggest piece there is to, stop and ask kids, how are they feeling? So similar to what you were describing, if something happens, there's a disagreement, someone's being left out. Well, how is the child picking up on this? And what is it actually doing to them? Are they having an emotional response? Because when we talk about research, it's a lot of averages. It's not about individual kids. So being able to sort of think through what's happening for this child, how are they feeling, how can we support them, I think is really important. There's sort of this idea sometimes that can happen where we have a norm where everyone has to be included by everyone. And I don't think that's the case. As adults, we don't all get along with everyone, so kids don't all have to get along with each other. So one thing that we could think about is sort of, well, who are they being excluded by? Is there another group with similar interests that they might get along with better? And how can we support those connections? So it doesn't just have to be about avoiding exclusion, but sort of thinking about where can we make those positive connections?
I really like that approach of focusing on the positive connections, because you're right, we don't always like everybody, and it's okay for children to not always have a strong connection with everyone, and helping them find the positive connections, I think is a great lesson and tool for them to be able to use throughout their life.
Yeah, so just sort of thinking like, if everyone's playing soccer and a child doesn't like soccer, they like art, well, don't force them to play soccer. Let's see if there's an art club maybe that they can get involved in.
Are there any resources you'd like to recommend for parents who kind of want to bolster their children's sense of belonging?
Yeah, I think if parents are looking for resources on how to think about connection and belonging and play, there's a few different websites that I'd recommend. So 0 to 3 is a nonprofit that has a lot of really great resources for all types of development, really. Their articles are written for parents by folks who studied this sort of stuff, and I find them very helpful as I'm kind of thinking about my own nieces and nephews. Another one is the Lego Foundation has some good ones about sort of different types of play, how to engage in different types of play, and how to encourage different types of play for kids, which can help with belonging.
Fantastic. Those are wonderful resources. Okay, well, this is the point in the podcast where we'll take a little break and hear a word from our sponsor.
This is what New Horizon Academy parents are saying about their family's experience at our schools.
He has formed special relationships with the teachers here, and that just makes us feel that much more excited to drop him off and to pick him up.
And then when we toured here, every single kid that we saw was laughing, giggling, smiling. The teachers looked happy, so we just felt immediate a peace.
New Horizon Academy offers premium early childhood development for all families. Check us out at newhorizonacademy.net.
We knew right away that it was the right fit for us.
Okay, welcome back. Now it's time in the podcast for our parent questions. So the first question comes from Jacob, and he says, as a parent of a 3-year-old, I've noticed my child is starting to navigate sharing and interacting with other kids. What are some effective strategies to encourage positive social behaviors like sharing and taking turns at this age?
Yeah, so I think parents can help shape positive behaviors in a few ways. And one of the first is sort of recognizing how old your child is and whether or not this is a developmentally appropriate behavior to expect. We can't expect kids to be doing things that 8-year-olds are doing when they're 3. But if we're at the right age, which if your child's 3, that seems like a good age for sharing. One of the first is we can model the behavior in front of our child. So rather than just saying you should share, we can practice sharing in front of them, giving things to another parent, a sibling, to them, sharing a bite of cookie, for instance, if you stop at the store to get one. Other things that we can do are play games that encourage sharing or that involve some type of sharing. And I think this one's kind of fun because you don't necessarily notice that a game involves sharing. Like if you're playing with a ball and you're throwing it back and forth, technically you're sharing the ball every time you pass it back and forth. Other things that can be helpful are things like empathizing with them. So if a child has something that they want, you can say things like, oh, I know you want that. It must be hard to watch someone else have that. When it's your turn, what will that be like? And then also doing the reverse. So if they have something that another person wants, saying, oh, well, what are they feeling? How are they looking? And kind of helping them identify that facial response to emotion. And then what do you think when you're done that they can have it? And things like that can really help promote sharing with kids. And then another piece is thinking about scaffolding. So kids are developing all sorts of abilities at different times. And if we're thinking about taking turns or sharing, they don't really understand the concept of time until somewhere between 3 and 5. So telling a 2-year-old to wait 15 minutes is not gonna do anything. But as they're starting to learn about time, not just saying, oh, you can have it in a minute, but being intentional with it. So your sister's gonna have this for 5 minutes, we're gonna set a timer. When that goes off, then it's your turn. Can really help them start to develop an idea of what sharing and turn taking can be.
Wonderful. I think those are really practical and easy tips that'll help anyone. I'm sure Jacob will find those helpful. Our next question comes from Hannah, and she says, as a parent, I'm concerned because my preschooler hasn't been invited to several birthday parties recently. Could this be a sign of social challenges? And how can I support my child in dealing with feelings of exclusion while helping them build stronger friendships?
Yeah, I think this can be really hard as a parent to see your child not be included in things. And I think there are a lot of reasons that it can happen, some of which have absolutely nothing to do with your child. So sometimes there's budgets for parties, or there's space considerations if it's in an apartment, and not everyone's going to fit into those spaces. So another reason could be if, the person whose birthday party it is a little bit older, your child's younger and still engaging in more of this sort of solo play or parallel independent play. It could be that your child's not invited because the activity is less geared toward them. So to me, none of those are a reason to be concerned. However, as kids are getting older, they're engaging more in that cooperative play where they're playing together. There's still lots of reasons they could not be invited, some of which I think are more or less concerning. So to get started with the less concerning ones, maybe your child just has different interests than the person whose party it is. And in that case, maybe instead of focusing on that party, it'd be helpful to find a group of people who have similar interests to your child. And that can help sort of develop some positive friendships for them moving forward. On the other end, which might be a little more concerning, maybe they weren't invited due to some inappropriate social behavior. And you won't really know if this is the case unless you're kind of watching them interact. So if you're paying attention to your child, you're noticing that they're not turn-taking or sharing in ways that other kids their age are, or they're doing some other things that feel not typical in social behavior, that could be a time where we start to have a little more concern. And I'd say the first step is probably talk to your child again, see, are they having any type of response to this? What is that response? If you're noticing these behaviors, are they understanding what you're saying? Are there ways to sort of model or help them correct those behaviors? And again, I think that's where those books with emotion identifiers or movies like Inside Out can be really helpful.
The final question comes from Aaliyah, and she says, as a parent of a 4-year-old, I'm curious about what typical play behaviors should look like at this age. How can I tell if my child's play is developmentally appropriate? And are there specific types of plays that help promote social and emotional growth?
Yeah, so I think 4 is a really fascinating age for this type of question, just because when we look at a young 4-year-old versus an almost 5-year-old, the type of play we're going to see is pretty different. So those younger 4s are going to be in that sort of associative play where they're not really playing together, but they're doing similar activities. Those ones who are closer to 5, we're going to expect to see more playing together in that cooperative play. And we might be seeing them sort of doing that imaginative play where they're making up different scenarios and trying to get buy-in from each other in those cases. So, and of course, we're talking about these like these are concrete stages that kids go through. But the reality is some kids go faster or slower than others, and that's all pretty appropriate. So, I would think about, do they have older siblings? Are there other older kids around? Maybe you're expecting them to do a little bit more of that cooperative or imaginative play then. If they're younger and they're the oldest in the family, for instance, maybe they're still doing more of that independent play, and that would be okay. So I think in terms of seeing if your child's play is developmentally appropriate, I would be looking for signs that they are feeling some type of negative emotion about it, maybe agitated that they're not able to play the way that they want to. Other kids are trying to include them and they're not responding to it. Those would be concerns, I think, for whether or not their play is inappropriate.
It's really helpful insight. With that, I just want to say, Amanda, thank you so much for being on. I believe this information is really critical because the better understanding we have of our children, the more supportive we can be in helping them nurture into really good people.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning in today's episode. We hope you found the conversation insightful and helpful as we explore the important topic of child social behavior. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and leave a review. Your support helps us reach more listeners and continue bringing you valuable content. Until next time, take care and keep nurturing those little ones. If you would like more information on this episode or need access to other resources mentioned, head to our website at newhorizonacademy.net. And if you have questions, please email us at parentingpickup@nhacademy.net. Thanks and have a great day.